She looked me straight in the eye and said, "How does it feel to be a loser, Dolores?" Loud enough for the whole table to hear. I didn't flinch. I just smiled and replied, "Funny. I was wondering the same about you." Then I stood up, took one envelope from my purse, and placed it in front of her husband, my son. That dinner wasn't just a meal. It was the moment everything began to unravel. Before I continue the story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. The sun had barely dipped below the rooftops when I pulled into Lyle's driveway. The street was lined with trimmed hedges and basketball hoops, the kind of neighborhood where garages stayed spotless and sprinklers hissed at dawn. I'd helped them afford this place once, back when Lyle lost his job and Vera's boutique failed. That was before my name stopped coming up in their stories. As I stepped out, I adjusted the scarf around my shoulders, more for comfort than warmth. Vera opened the door before I could knock, arms folded like a border guard. "You made it," she said, her lips forming a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon cleaner. Their home was pristine, everything in its place, except perhaps me. "You can sit there," Vera motioned, barely looking, toward a chair pulled awkwardly close to the trash can. My heart hesitated before my feet did, but I smiled, nodding. I sat. The metal of the bin brushed against my leg every time I shifted. The sound of clinking cutlery floated from the kitchen. A framed photo of the family, the three of them, no room left in the frame, stared back at me from the mantel. Lyle appeared next, patting his pockets like he'd misplaced his manners. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning in for a brief, distracted hug. Cassian was already on the couch, thumbs flying over his phone screen, earbuds tucked in like a defense system. "Hi, Grandma," he mumbled, eyes not lifting. Vera set the table with a flair I recognized from her old Instagram posts. The perfect hostess. She glanced at my plate. "No fried chicken for you tonight. We're watching your cholesterol, remember?" Her voice coated the words in sugar. I nodded, letting it pass. Lyle asked about traffic. I answered. Vera commented on the weather. I agreed. The silence between each exchange stretched like worn elastic. Cassian didn't say another word, and neither did I, not really. Not the words that mattered. As I reached for the salad, my hand brushed the trash can lid. I moved it slightly away with a sigh, unnoticed. "Retired now, right?" Vera said suddenly, sipping her wine. "Must be strange, not having anything to do all day." "I manage," I said quietly, offering her a smile that wasn't real. I glanced at Lyle, who fiddled with his napkin. "I mean," she continued, cutting into her chicken, "after working so long, I bet it's hard to adjust, especially with limited savings." It was like a game, poke and prod, see if the old woman snaps. Lyle stayed silent. Cassian was still scrolling. I counted to 3 before answering. "I planned for it. I'm fine." The laugh came from nowhere. A short, sharp burst from Vera, followed by a smirk. "How does it feel to be a loser?" The fork paused halfway to my mouth. Even Cassian looked up. Vera blinked at her wine like it was the one that had spoken. "Oh, I didn't mean it like that." I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I swallowed the bite, set the fork down and folded my hands on the table. I had seen storms roll in slower than that moment. Inside, something tightened, not rage, but resolve. I thought of every night I stayed with Cassian when they were off finding themselves. Every dollar that patched their lives back together. Every weekend I gave up so they could rest. And now I was seated by the trash. Dinner continued, but the mood had shifted. Lyle kept his eyes on his plate. Vera talked too much. Cassian disappeared upstairs. When it was done, I stood and gathered my own dishes. From the kitchen, I heard Vera whisper, "She's so clingy." I set the plate down gently in the sink. Then I turned, walked to the door, and reached for my coat. As I opened it, I glanced back. You'll see how losers smile in court. The ride home was quieter than usual. even for me. My old sedan hummed along the Houston streets, the glow from traffic lights casting patterns across the dashboard. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't need the noise. My thoughts were already loud enough. Loser. The word echoed like a whisper on repeat, soft but cutting. Vera's laugh had come too easily, too comfortably. And the others, silent, complicit. My son, my own flesh and blood, had looked down at his plate as if a casserole dish might shield him from the moment. As I drove through the familiar streets, I passed the elementary school where I used to wait for Lyle in the carpool line. I remembered the winter coat he once begged for in middle school, and how I'd put off fixing the furnace for a month just to get it for him. And yet, here I was, driving home in the dark, dismissed like a stranger, not even a thank you left in their mouths. I turned the corner onto my street, the sodium streetlights blinking tiredly overhead. Just like me. Inside my condo, I kicked off my shoes and set my purse down with a sigh. I picked up my phone from the table, the lock screen lighting up with my message from 3 weeks ago. Thinking of you and Cassian. Want me to bring dinner this weekend? Still no reply. I tapped on his name, listening as the line rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't trust it would stay there. Across town, I imagined Lyle's phone lighting up. I imagined Vera glancing at it, rolling her eyes, her hand reaching out, casually deleting my text with the same carelessness she might flick away a crumb on the table. The silence wasn't just accidental anymore. It was curated, maintained. I stood in the living room, the quiet now suffocating. The same 4 walls that had once held warmth, echoes of bedtime stories and laughter, now stood as reminders of what I no longer had. I pulled open the old oak drawer under my bookshelf. Inside were papers, documents I hadn't looked at in years. Lyle's birth certificate, Cassian's hand-drawn birthday card, mortgage forms, receipts with my signature next to dollar amounts that once felt like lifelines. My lifelines, cut and forgotten. I sat on the edge of my couch and let the papers rest on my lap like a weight I couldn't quite shake. They weren't just papers. They were proof. Of love. Of effort. Of me. Then I remembered, at dinner, I'd set my phone face down while helping Cassian with his napkin. I'd forgotten to stop the recording app I'd opened earlier to jot down a grocery list. Heart pounding, I opened the voice memo app and pressed play. There was the clatter of forks, Vera's voice sharp and clear. She's just so pathetic. Laughter. Lyle's voice, quieter but distinct. She doesn't know when to stop. And then Cassian, my sweet boy. She's always so needy. I paused the recording. My finger hovered over delete. Instead, I hit save. I replayed it once more, this time letting it sink into my skin like cold rain. But I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat, breathing, feeling, knowing. The silence I'd been handed was no longer empty. It was full of truth. Later, I walked to my small window and stared out into the night. Streetlights flickered over the parked cars, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror my thoughts. I was never weak, I whispered to the glass. I just believed too long. From the shelf, I pulled down an old notebook with frayed edges and flipped past recipes and notes. Near the back, I found it. Margot Baines, a friend from years ago. A woman who had once said, "If you ever need to fight, don't do it unarmed." I underlined her name. Then I closed the book, not with finality, but with purpose. I woke before the sun. The room was cloaked in blue-gray light, and the shadows along the walls felt longer than usual. Sleep had been thin and full of fits, snippets of old voices, unfinished thoughts. I sat up, the worn flannel blanket slipping from my shoulders, and rubbed the ache from my knees. Another day alone, but not untouched. The air was still. I walked through the condo barefoot, each step a memory. My fingers brushed the frames along the hallway. Lyle's second-grade school portrait with the crooked tie, the photo from our last Christmas together, everyone pretending. I stopped by the linen closet and opened the bottom drawer. Folded carefully beneath old towels was a rolled-up paper, the blueprint of the house we helped them buy. Its corners were frayed, the paper yellowed. But there it was, the living room, the two-car garage, the back patio I never once stood on after moving day. This was for all of us, Walter had said back then. A future. Security. Somewhere we're always welcome. Funny now how welcome had become such a distant word. I moved to the kitchen, put on coffee. I didn't cry, I didn't speak. I simply existed in the echo of choices made long ago. It started as a need to remember, just to confirm the story was still true. I sat at the dining table, opened my laptop, and typed in the county property site. It took a few minutes to navigate. I knew the address by heart. There it was. The house. Same red brick, same bay window where we hung snowflake stickers every December. I scrolled. Owner, Lyle Crow. No co-signers, no mention of me or Walter, not even as a lien holder. But we had signed the paperwork, hadn't we? I could still see the bank officer's smile, the click of his pen, and that check, the one we wrote to cover a third of the down payment. Walter had said, "It's not a loan, it's family." The silence in the condo suddenly felt different. Not quiet, vacant. My name had been removed not with scissors, but by never being written in at all. I was never on the deed. They didn't forget me. They made sure I was never there to begin with. I closed the laptop. The coffee had gone cold. There was another drawer I hadn't opened in years. In the bedroom, beneath the cedar-lined chest, wrapped in velvet, lay a brooch. At least it used to. I remembered it clearly. A silver pin shaped like an iris, delicate and old, passed down from my grandmother, who wore it at her wedding. I had given it to Vera after she married Lyle, a gesture of trust, of inclusion. I'd told her, "This is for you now. May it bring you good fortune." Last year, during a late-night scroll through eBay, I'd stumbled on a brooch that looked nearly identical, listed by a user named VBTX. The profile picture was unmistakably Vera's, taken at a Christmas party years ago, red lipstick and all. I messaged the seller. "Is this real silver?" The listing was deleted the next morning. When I asked Vera about it weeks later, she'd shrugged. "Oh, that. I lost it ages ago." I never pressed. There was no point. Now, sitting at the edge of my bed, I felt the loss differently. Not of a trinket, but of intention. Nothing I gave had been sacred. Everything could be sold, forgotten, erased. Even me. I opened the memo app on my phone. I typed, "Stop giving." Then stared, then deleted, then typed again. "Give wisely, and know when to stop." I stared at those words for a long time. My thumb hovered over the screen, then tapped save. I set the phone down, stood, and walked to the window. The city was beginning to stir, but everything below still looked so still. I whispered to the glass. I was never weak. I just believed too long. From the bookshelf, I pulled down an old leather notebook. Its pages smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. Flipping past blank pages and old grocery lists, I found the one I wanted. I wrote a name. Gloria Melton. A lawyer. An old friend from a time before I was just Mom or Nana. She helped me when Walter passed. Nothing major, just the estate paperwork. But she was kind, thorough, fierce. I underlined her name. Slowly. Twice. Then I closed the notebook and pressed it to my chest. Some part of me trembled. Another part had already gone still. I didn't call her yet, but I could, and that possibility felt like oxygen. The knock at the door was light, almost polite. I expected no one. When I opened it, a young man in a brown uniform handed me a large envelope and asked me to sign for it. I scribbled my name, still groggy from a mid-afternoon nap I hadn't planned. Inside the envelope was a neat packet of papers, legal in nature, judging by the language and layout. My eyes caught my own name typed across the top of the page, followed by numbers I couldn't make sense of, and then, unmistakably, my signature. But I hadn't signed anything like this. Not for financial decisions. Not recently. My hands trembled slightly as I reread the document, trying to find context. A memory flickered. Months ago, Vera handing me a stack of papers labeled insurance updates after my minor surgery. She'd watched as I initialed and signed page after page, brushing off my questions with "just formalities, Mom." Now here it was, a financial agreement with my name, used without my knowledge. I set the papers down, letting the weight of betrayal settle across my chest like a winter coat I hadn't chosen to wear. Eleanor met me at the corner cafe just as the church bells chimed 3. She wore the same lavender cardigan I remembered from our weekly prayer circles years ago. We hugged a little awkwardly, like two people trying to bridge a long gap with old threads. "I heard you were having trouble," she said gently, wrapping her hands around her tea mug. I hesitated. I wouldn't call it trouble exactly, just something off. Eleanor's eyes darkened. "I saw Vera, at a financial office months ago. She was asking about signature transfers. Mentioned your name, said you might be too tired for legal stuff, but cooperative." I blinked. She continued. "I didn't know if it was serious, but I remembered it today. You're not crazy, Dolores. They're just hoping you won't fight back." Her voice steadied me. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't paranoid. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Thank you. That means more than you know." That evening, the doorbell rang again. Lyle stood there, holding Cassian by the shoulder. "Thought we'd drop in," he said, too casually. "Cassian wanted to see you." Cassian gave me a brief hug, arms barely touching. We sat for a few minutes, small talk echoing off the walls. Then Cassian looked up and said, "Can you stop causing trouble for Mom and Dad?" He said it plainly, like asking me to stop watching the news too loud. Lyle didn't correct him. He just shifted uncomfortably. The silence stretched. I placed a hand on Cassian's knee, then took it back. "Of course," I said softly. "Tell your mom I'll be more mindful." He smiled, relieved, and Lyle stood to leave. As the door closed behind them, I stood there, not moving. My grandson had been used like a shield, and I had been labeled the attacker. I made myself a cup of mint tea and sat out on the patio. The Texas sky was beginning to bruise with evening. I opened my old leather-bound address book, thumbing through pages. Some names were crossed out. Old neighbors who'd moved, cousins who'd drifted, but some were still there. Lawyers, advocates, even a coworker from my temp job years ago, now working in family mediation. I didn't feel angry. I felt aligned. I scribbled down a list. I didn't know who I'd call yet, but I would. "If they want to treat me like a burden," I whispered, "I'll show them what a burden can carry." I folded the financial agreement, slipped it into a new envelope, addressed it, and sealed it. Who would receive it wasn't important right now. What mattered was that I wasn't powerless anymore. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the chill in the air or the way sunlight filtered through my kitchen blinds. It was the silence, not just the kind you expect at 7 a.m. on a weekday, but the digital kind, the kind that hums at you when your phone hasn't buzzed in hours. I picked up my phone, sipped my coffee, and instinctively opened our family group chat. Or tried to. It wasn't there. I blinked, thinking I'd tapped the wrong icon. I searched again. Nothing. I typed family chat into the message search bar. Still nothing. "Lyle?" I called a few minutes later, dialing him as I stirred oatmeal on the stove. "Did something happen to the family group chat? I can't seem to find it." He hesitated. Maybe a glitch? Vera updated the settings or something. You know how apps are." I said nothing. Just hummed like I accepted it. but my gut churned. Later that afternoon, Eleanor sent me a screenshot with no explanation. I didn't need one. There it was, a message that read, "Vera removed Dolores from the group." Just like that. Removed. Not a word. No explanation. Nothing. And suddenly, the silence made sense. It wasn't just the group chat. That evening, I ran into Betty from my old book club at the grocery store. We exchanged pleasantries before she leaned in, voice low. "I heard you're skipping Thanksgiving this year." "That's a shame." I blinked. "Skipping? Who told you that?" She tilted her head, confused. "Vera mentioned you didn't want to come. Said you needed rest." The words landed like a slap. I stood frozen by the canned yams, trying to keep my face calm. "Well," I said with a smile I didn't feel, "we all need rest, I suppose." When I got home, I sat in the living room staring at the fireplace I never used. How easily Vera turned absence into rejection. How easily silence could be shaped into insult. They weren't just shutting me out, they were rewriting the story. The next morning I didn't call, I didn't text. I dressed neatly, printed the screenshot Eleanor had sent me, and drove to their house. Cassian opened the door. His eyes lit up, then dimmed a little, probably remembering whatever version of the story he'd been fed. "Is your dad home?" He nodded and let me in without a word. Lyle appeared seconds later, followed by Vera, who wore her usual smile of tight-lipped concern. "I need to speak with both of you," I said, voice calm. We sat at the kitchen table. I placed the printout in front of them. Vera glanced at it. "Oh, that. It wasn't anything personal, Dolores." "I didn't say it was," I replied. "But it was deliberate." Lyle shifted in his chair. "Mom, we thought maybe you needed some space." "Did you invite me to Thanksgiving?" Vera folded her arms. "We assumed you were still upset after the dinner incident." "I wasn't upset. I was disrespected," I said plainly. "And now, I'm being erased." Cassian wandered into the room, standing awkwardly by the fridge. I turned to him. "Cassian, do you know why I won't be at Thanksgiving?" He looked to his parents. Vera opened her mouth, but I raised a hand. "Love doesn't lie, Cassian," I said softly. "One day you'll understand." I stood, folded the screenshot back into my purse, and walked out the door without another word. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. The house behind me faded into the rearview mirror, and with it, the person I had been trying to be for them. As I pulled into traffic, my phone vibrated. One missed call, from a name I hadn't seen in years. Helen's office was colder than I remembered. Maybe it was the air conditioning, or maybe it was what she slid across the desk toward me. A manila folder with my name on it. "I pulled your housing paperwork," she said softly. "There was a transfer attempt, without your signature." I stared at the folder like it might bite. My hand trembled slightly as I opened it and scanned the document. Sure enough, there it was. A line where my signature should have been, a shaky imitation, not mine. "Vera?" I asked. Helen nodded. "I can't say officially, but the timing lines up with some of the paperwork she filed for your medical records, claims of instability. They tried to move assets into her name. It didn't go through, but they tried." I exhaled sharply, feeling something settle deep in my stomach. Not fear, not grief. A quiet, boiling anger that spread from my chest to my fingertips. They weren't just turning my family against me. They were trying to erase me altogether. Last Sunday, I had gone to church like I always did, dressed in my lavender blouse and the pearl earrings Walter had given me for our 25th anniversary. It was my sanctuary, my place of peace. As I entered the vestibule, I heard whispers. Two women from the choir stood by the bulletin board, eyes darting toward me. "Isn't she the one they kicked out?" one murmured. "Yeah, heard she had an episode. Her daughter-in-law said she might not be safe on her own. I didn't stop walking. My hands were clasped in front of me, but inside my lungs burned. I sat through the entire Mass without moving, not even to take communion. My palms dug into the hem of my skirt, holding in everything I wanted to scream. Vera had lied. She had lied in God's house, and I had let it happen in silence. Monday morning, I called Lyle. No texts this time. I needed to hear his voice. "Hey, Mom," he answered, distracted. "I need to ask you something," I said, cutting to the chase. "Did Vera tell people I was unstable, that I needed to be removed from the condo?" There was a long pause. "Mom, people were asking questions. She was just trying to explain. So you let her say I was crazy?" My voice cracked, and not from weakness, from fury. "I didn't say that," he said quickly. "You're reading into it too much." "I heard them, Lyle. At church. They think I'm unstable." He sighed. "You're making this worse than it needs to be." "No, Lyle," I said, a chill spreading in my words. "You already made it worse. I'm just catching up." The line went dead. Back home, I cleared the kitchen table and laid out every document Helen had given me. Power of attorney, revoked. Tenant protections, filed. Proof of financial contribution, documented. My old health records, showing nothing close to mental instability. I placed them neatly in a row, like chess pieces waiting for my move. Then I opened my notebook and wrote one word in big, bold letters. Fight. I whispered aloud. You took my silence as surrender. That was your mistake. My hand reached for the phone. I didn't call Lyle. I didn't call Vera. I called a name I hadn't said out loud in over a decade. Someone Vera never thought I'd remember. The line rang. "This is Dolores," I said when they answered. "I think we have something in common." The binder clicked softly as I flipped through the pages, each one a revelation darker than the last. The documents Helen had passed along were orderly, too orderly, compiled with a calm hand that knew exactly what to look for. I stared at the top sheet, a notarized letter from a woman in Kansas. My daughter-in-law isolated me gradually, it read, until I wasn't allowed to visit my grandchildren. Underneath it, another. Vera Sims encouraged my son to declare me mentally unfit. I didn't know the names, but I knew the pain. These weren't accidents. They were blueprints. Vera had done this before. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from recognition. This wasn't a storm she had summoned on a whim. It was her method, her routine. I wasn't the first, but I would be the last. A soft knock pulled me from the abyss. Helen stood in the doorway, clutching a manila folder to her chest. She didn't smile, just nodded and walked in. "I brought more," she said, settling into the armchair. "Vera's fingerprints are on several similar cases. Different cities, different names, same outcome." I looked at her, stunned. "How long have you known?" She didn't blink. "Long enough. But you were the first one who asked the right questions." Something inside me loosened, just a little. I had been shouting into a void, and now someone had answered. "She's good at keeping her hands clean," Helen added. "But you're not crazy, Dolores. And you're not alone." Those words, ones I didn't even know I needed, landed like warm rain on dry ground. I nodded, not trusting my voice. My world had cracked open, but now I had a map. That night, as the shadows lengthened across my living room, I returned to the binder. I wasn't looking for more dirt on Vera. I was trying to find something of myself in all this. Between the last few pages, a letter fluttered out. It was Walter's handwriting. I froze. He had written to me before his surgery, something I hadn't been able to face since he passed. My fingers hesitated before unfolding the page. "My dearest D," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm probably not around to tell you in person, but I need you to remember something. In any trial, you were the wisest among us. I saw how you held this family together. I saw you. Tears welled, not from grief this time, but from grounding. Each word wrapped around the ache inside me like gauze. I clutched the letter to my chest. He had seen me, even when no one else had. Morning came like a quiet visitor. I made coffee, then sat at the kitchen table with a stack of legal pads and a pen. Helen's folder rested beside my own notes, and Walter's letter lay like a compass in front of me. I drew 3 columns: witnesses, evidence, timeline. I wrote slowly, methodically. Eleanor, Helen, financial records, audio recordings. I pieced together the narrative like a quilt, each square a scar turned into armor. I wouldn't attack, not yet, but I would defend. As I circled the date for the court petition filing, my phone buzzed on the table. A text. Court date is set. I exhaled, my fingers still hovering above the ink. They thought this was about being invited to Thanksgiving, about a group chat, about a seat near the trash can. But it had never been about that. This was about identity, about dignity, about the erasure of someone who had once been the center of it all. And I was done being erased. The courtroom was colder than I expected, even in the Texas summer. I sat upright at the plaintiff's table, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the air smelled of paper and polish. Helen, my attorney, leaned close and whispered, "Are you ready?" I nodded. Ready wasn't the right word, but I was present. I was here. The judge, an older man with deep lines etched across his brow, looked at me with a stillness I hadn't seen in years. "Mrs. Moreno, you may proceed," he said. His voice was dry, without sympathy or contempt, just the voice of a man whose job was to listen. I stood. "My name is Dolores Moreno," I began. "I am 68 years old. I have worked, raised a son, buried a husband, and survived indignities I would not wish on anyone." I told them about the house, the help I gave Lyle and Vera when they were newly married, the way they leaned on me after Walter died. I didn't speak in anger. I spoke in fact. No trembling hands, no pleading voice, just the story, my story. Helen gave me a subtle nod when I finished. The judge gave nothing away. Then she stood and moved to the screen. "We'd like to introduce a video," Helen said, turning toward the monitor the courtroom used for exhibits. Submitted by a neighbor of the plaintiff, recorded on a doorbell camera. It started with my own voice, shaky but kind. "Cassian, do you want some pie?" Then the reply, clear and sharp. "Why do you always make everything about you, Grandma?" The courtroom was silent. Then came Vera's voice, mocking, cruel. "She just wants attention. She always does." Laughter followed. Not mine. Not ever mine. I couldn't look away from the screen, but I also didn't flinch. Vera shifted beside her attorney, her arms folding tight across her chest. "And here," Helen pointed to the screen, "is the timestamp of when this was shared among multiple people in their neighborhood group chat, without Mrs. Moreno's consent." The judge's jaw flexed, ever so slightly. I didn't smile, but I knew something had shifted. I stood again for my final statement. My knees did not buckle. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said quietly. "I'm here because a home is not just bricks and wood. It's where we build our legacy. I helped build that house. I believed I'd always be welcome in it. I was wrong." A murmur ran through the gallery, but I ignored it. "I've decided to transfer ownership of the home, not to myself, but to a charity. The Walter Moreno Foundation will help elderly tenants facing eviction, because no one should be cast out of what they helped build." Helen nodded. The judge looked over his glasses and scribbled something on his pad. "Mrs. Moreno," he said after a pause, "your actions today, your clarity and your dignity, speak louder than any accusation." He turned to Vera. "This court finds that all transfer attempts were fraudulent. Mrs. Moreno's rights are reinstated. A permanent protection order will be filed." Vera didn't speak. Lyle didn't even look up. I gathered my papers. I looked over to Eleanor, who sat in the back, her hands clasped at her chest. When our eyes met, she mouthed, "You did it." But I didn't feel victorious. I felt balanced, as though I had finally stepped off a ship I'd been trapped on for too long and placed my feet on solid ground. As I walked down the aisle, the judge's last words echoed in my mind. Loss is not the end. It is only where we begin again. The hallway outside the courtroom was buzzing, but I moved through it like a ghost. Reporters leaned in with microphones, their voices cutting through the din, but I didn't respond. My steps were slow, deliberate. I had no need for statements or headlines. The verdict had been spoken, not just by the judge, but by time, by truth, and by everything I had survived. As I reached the glass doors, a flash from someone's phone camera made me flinch. Behind me, I heard Vera's name being muttered by a small crowd. Their tones weren't sympathetic. I caught one man whisper, "Is that the daughter-in-law who tried to evict her own mother-in-law?" I kept walking. Out in the Houston air, I let out a long breath. It wasn't relief. Not entirely. It was the pressure leaving my chest after weeks, no years, of being compressed into silence. I stood on the sidewalk for a while, letting the sun touch my face. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just let myself be still. Eleanor opened the door before I knocked. Her arms were around me in an instant, and for the first time in a long time, I let them stay there. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." Inside her living room, the familiar smell of cinnamon tea and lemon cleaner wrapped around me. Safe. Familiar. We sat in silence for several minutes. No need to fill it with noise. I noticed her eyes lingering on me longer than usual, as if she were taking inventory of the bruises unseen, of the shifts in my posture. Later that evening, I returned to my condo. A call came from one of my nieces in North Carolina, a woman I hadn't heard from in years. She said she'd seen a local news article about the case. "I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you," she said, "and I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner." It was brief, but it warmed something brittle inside me. The next morning, I opened the neighborhood blog on my laptop. There was a thread titled, "What kind of son lets this happen?" and several comments beneath it. Some defended Lyle, most didn't. Another post linked a video clip from the courtroom with Cassian looking away as his mother argued with my lawyer. The replies were sharp, unforgiving. Parents in the community talked about teaching their kids better. One simply wrote, "This is why character matters." I read through them quietly. Not gloating, just absorbing. There was something poetic about justice finding its way through digital wires, the same wires that once carried Vera's lies. And while I wouldn't dance on the ashes, I wouldn't look away from them either. At dusk, I sat by the window with my tea. The light spilled across the floor, golden and soft. I didn't need the headlines or the apologies that never came. I had something better. Space to think, to breathe, to begin again. On Sunday, I hosted dinner. Nothing elaborate. Roasted chicken, sweet potatoes, salad with cranberries and walnuts. Eleanor came, and so did my niece, who drove all the way from Austin. The table wasn't full, but it was full enough. We talked about books, travel, the charity foundation in Walter's name. Not once did we mention Vera or Lyle. Their absence wasn't a shadow. It was a space I no longer felt compelled to fill. After dessert, I walked my niece to her car. She hugged me tight and said, "You're stronger than most people I know." I smiled, truly smiled, and replied, "I just stopped letting them confuse love with silence." That night, I made a list, things to do, projects to start, people to reconnect with. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that dinner all those chapters ago. That woman was still inside me, yes. But now, she had a spine reinforced by experience and a heart unshackled by guilt. As the sky turned dark, I stood on my patio and looked up. Not all bridges had burned. Some had simply been rerouted. The morning light slanted across my bedroom floor like a ribbon of silk, soft and undemanding. I woke before the alarm, not from anxiety, but from habit. The quiet didn't carry dread anymore. It simply was. In the stillness, I thought about the past few weeks. Courtroom stares, whispered apologies, and the silence that used to wound but now rested gently around me. The house no longer felt like a cage. It was mine again. Later, on my walk through the neighborhood, I noticed small changes. Mrs. Jennings, who used to avoid eye contact, gave me a nod and a tight smile. The Thompsons waved from their porch. Nothing overt, but these gestures, once withheld, felt like tiny bridges being rebuilt without words. Respect wasn't announced. It was lived. That afternoon, I scrolled through the news. A community piece described a local charity's donation, the foundation I'd set up in Walter's name. The article briefly mentioned my case, delicately worded, but the message was clear. In the comments section, someone had written, "Not everyone's story makes the front page, but it still matters." I knew that person. An old co-worker. There were other mentions. Vera and Cassian weren't invisible anymore. They were seen for what they'd done. I didn't celebrate. But inside, a scale balanced quietly. Eleanor and I met at the community center just past noon. She handed me a clipboard with volunteer sign-up sheets and a mischievous smile. "Looks like you're officially one of us again," she teased. I chuckled. Did I ever stop being? We spent the day organizing boxes for families in need. A teenage volunteer, shy but curious, asked me, "Were you the woman in that news video?" I looked at him and said, "I'm the woman who didn't stay quiet." At lunch, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years stopped by. We didn't talk about the past, just shared soup and laughter. That was enough. I found myself writing again. Notes, ideas, a possible memoir outline. I didn't know what shape it would take, but I knew one thing. I wouldn't be erased. By evening, I'd prepared a modest meal: roast chicken, rice, steamed greens. My niece, her partner, and Eleanor joined me. Halfway through dinner, Lyle walked in. Alone. He looked thinner, eyes sunken, voice lower. "Can I sit?" I nodded. We didn't rehash the past. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't offer comfort. But when he quietly said, "I didn't know how bad it had gotten," I replied, "You didn't want to." Cassian didn't come, but he'd texted earlier. It was short. "Hi, Grandma. I hope you're okay." That was enough for now. As dishes were cleared and conversations mellowed, I looked around the table. The silence wasn't tense. It was sacred, earned through fire and kept alive by dignity. I stood and made tea for everyone. No grand speeches, no announcements. But when I caught Eleanor's eye, I knew she saw it too. I had won. Not by fighting louder, but by standing, wholly, when they expected me to vanish. The air felt lighter that night, and I finally realized the past may linger, but it no longer dictates the story. I woke at first light, the hush of early morning wrapping around me like a gentle reminder. No urgency, just time. Finally. A luxury. I brewed tea and settled at the kitchen table, journal open and pen in hand. I began to write slowly, not to relive the pain, but to remember what still mattered. Names filled the page: Lyle, Cassian, Eleanor, Helen. Each followed by a small note: no blame, just truth. Lyle, torn between guilt and denial. Cassian, still finding his footing in a world that didn't teach him grace. Eleanor, steadfast presence. Helen, ally I hadn't known to expect. Vera, boundary firmly in place. Healing, as I understood now, didn't erase the fractures. It only acknowledged which could be bridged and which must remain apart. Later that day, a small package arrived at my door. No return address, no note. Just a handmade ceramic dish, painted with a sunflower and the words, "You were heard." I recognized the handwriting. My cousin, Margot, who had quietly vanished from my life years ago. The gesture was simple, but to me, it felt monumental. I held the dish in my hands, my heart steadying. A subtle shift was happening. Support was emerging from where I least expected it. Perhaps there was a chance for grace, the kind that didn't demand reconciliation, but offered peace. That evening, I had a rare opportunity. Vera was expected to pass by the neighborhood grocery. I saw her as I loaded my cart. She glanced at me, eyes brief, cautious. I didn't turn away. I didn't approach. Instead, I looked at her calmly and nodded, a gesture of acknowledgement, not approval. She hesitated, then nodded back. Not a truce, just recognition. Enough. At home, I prepared tea and dinner for Eleanor and my niece from Austin. The table was modest: lemon chicken, green beans, a small bundt cake, but it felt rich with meaning. We didn't rehash tragedies. We spoke quietly about books, old memories, and future plans that included a small charity event I was helping organize. The room carried stories, yes, but more importantly, it carried warmth. Before they left, my niece helped clear the table. She turned to me and said quietly, "I'm proud of who you are. Not despite it all, but because of it." I watched her go and stood by the window, breathing deep. The past hadn't vanished. It wouldn't ever. But it no longer defined the chapters yet to come. And tonight, that felt enough. The morning light filtered through my kitchen window, soft and golden, as I settled outside with my journal. The garden around me stirred gently, hibiscus petals trembling in a mild breeze, the scent of freshly cut grass mingling with my thoughts. I wrote slowly, each word deliberate, reflecting on the journey I'd traveled, from betrayal to this moment of quiet empowerment. I wrote about the lessons I'd learned about boundaries, resilience, and the strength of a quiet heart. No grand epiphanies, just deep understanding and clarity. Later, I walked into the community center, greeting familiar faces with a nod and a warm smile. Today, I spoke at a small gathering, a group of neighbors and friends who'd seen my story rise and ripple through our town. I shared what I'd learned, how love doesn't require silence, how setting boundaries isn't unloving, and how we can protect souls without waging war. Everyone listened, some nodding, others wiping away tears. It wasn't about teaching, just passing along what I needed when I was lost. Back at home, I reflected on the quiet justice that had unfolded. I hadn't sought revenge. I watched as Vera's reputation softened. Not violently, but fading under the weight of her own actions. Even Cassian's friends now hesitated around him, as if witnessing behavior no longer tolerated. I felt no delight in their downfall, only the satisfaction of knowing balance had been restored. True justice doesn't roar. It lands. I held that thought like a talisman. As evening settled, I stood in the garden again, shrubs and small lavender blooms brushing against my hands. My journal lay on the bench beside me, and I closed it gently, taking a deep, steady breath. Inside, I'd planned what comes next. Plans for the foundation, stories to help others understand their strength, ideas for a memoir. Somewhere between the soil and the sky, I felt a current of purpose hum through me. I had lost much, but I'd gained something deeper, myself. I looked up at the stars beginning to scatter across the Houston sky. The past was no longer a chain around my ankles. It was a foundation under my feet. Tonight, I didn't feel broken, but rooted and free. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that silence doesn't keep the peace, it just delays the storm. Speaking up for yourself, even when your voice trembles, is how you reclaim your worth. Families are complicated. Love can be twisted into control, But you are not weak for wanting peace. You are brave for demanding respect. To those of you watching who felt erased, overlooked, or made to question your own sanity, let this be your reminder. You matter. Your story matters. And standing your ground doesn't make you difficult. It makes you strong. So what about you? Have you ever faced a moment when standing up meant standing alone? Do you think forgiveness requires trust? Or can peace exist without reconciliation? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation going in the comments. If this video touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments or tell me where you're watching from. And if you didn't vibe with it, tell me why. I welcome all views. If you want more real stories like this that speak to the strength we find in the hardest places, hit that subscribe button. Let's grow together, one story at a time.